Hello and welcome to Fatten, a podcast where we get into the thick of it. My name is Layla Cameron and I am an academic, journalist, and artist. Most of my work revolves around body politics and fat liberation. This season, we're exploring what it's like to be fat in Vancouver, a place often referred to as Canada's thinnest city. One of the most popular sites for discussions about fatness might just be plus size fashion. We all need clothes to wear, but for those in plus size categories, we have quite limited options. When I first moved to Vancouver, I quickly realized that there were maybe one or two stores where I could walk in and find something in my size. These limited options mean that fat people don't really get to experiment with clothes or discover their personal style. Instead, we are usually just trying to desperately find something or anything that fits. The guest for this episode is Lydia Okello, a non-binary Black digital creator who works in the fashion industry. Their style is vibrant and challenges the ways that fat people have been encouraged to dress their bodies. Their work has been published in sites like Vogue, Glamour, and Refinery29. Lydia is also a model signed with Vancouver's Stranger Agency and has been featured in campaigns for companies like Lush and Roots. In this episode, Lydia and I talk about their entry into the fashion industry, what has changed in recent years, and what still needs to be amended. Lydia's work gives me hope for the future of fat fashion. Yes, even here in Vancouver.
I'm Lydia Okello. I am a queer, non-binary, fat person living and working in Vancouver, and I work in the fashion space, largely to do with like personal style, sustainability, and also plus size fashion and what that kind of means and what that looks like moving forward. That's kind of like a succinct summary.
Can I ask, in terms of identifying as a fat person, if there are specific terms or specific terminology that you use? Some folks identify on the fat spectrum as like a mid-fat or a super fat, or are you just comfortable with sort of fat as a blanket term?
I usually say fat, but I recently was kind of looking at current rubrics within like fat activist spaces, and I think I would fall in sort of a mid-fat space. I'm about like a size 20 to 24, depending on, the brand. Sizing is fake and very inconsistent, so take from that what you will. But yeah, generally I just like refer to myself as fat. But if we were going to kind of more like size specifics or size politics, I would say I'm about a mid-fat.
I like that you pointed out that sizing is fake, because that's probably one of the most difficult things about online shopping as a fat person is you just have no idea what a size 20 actually is. And it's always kind of a gamble when you get a package on your doorstep and you have to kind of pull it open and just see for yourself. It's a bit frustrating. I feel like that's part of the fat tax, where you have to pay extra money for this guessing game. Have you always worked in plus size fashion and plus size fashion spaces as a digital creator, or is this something that you've kind of moved into over time?
Digitally, the work that I did kind of began as not necessarily work per se. It was more of a hobby. So I started posting outfits online in 2008, and I kind of came across like a community of people who had, maybe, I don't know if alternative is quite the right word, but less mainstream style. And joining those communities, I then found more like curvy bloggers and fat bloggers, and realized that even though I felt like I was an outsider in fashion, there were other people with bodies that didn't sort of, quote, fit into fashion that were making it work and really doing some interesting work, and were also kind of my introduction to like more fat politics and body positivity and all of those sort of frameworks.
You said that when you discovered other fat creators online that you found people who were making it work. And I'm wondering if you can explain sort of what you mean by that. What does it mean to make something work for you?
I mean, at that time, let's say like 2008 to even like 2014, 2015, the options for fat people, which sidebar are still very terrible, but or limited, I should say. They're not all terrible, but they're definitely very limited. But the options at that time for just literal clothing that you can put on your body was so narrow, and so many things that were not aesthetically pleasing or comfortable or even like affordable necessarily. So when I say that they were making it work, it was that I was finding people who would find that one great dress, find that one cool top, find, tights that actually fit fat people from this one retailer that would ship to North America or whatever it would be. There were people who, like me, didn't feel like their body should be a restriction to their expression, despite what the fashion industry has often said and shown.
I want to ask as well, I'm curious about how you started off your career in the fashion industry. What was that experience like?
I actually started working in fashion as like a teenager. I grew up in the suburbs of Vancouver, and I worked in various like clothing retail and just like apparel. My first job was at American Eagle Outfitters in my local mall. I felt very cool, and I was very surprised that they hired me. So all of those were straight size stores. So even though I wasn't necessarily straight sized the whole time that I worked there, initially I was kind of like at the very edge of straight sizing. At that point in my life, I was really, really steeped in diet culture, and I really wanted to be thin. So for me, it was like a motivating factor. I was like, great, like I have access to cooler clothes. If only I lose the weight, if only I become this ideal, then I can just fit in and I won't have to worry about it anymore. And thinking back now, that's like, it makes me really sad because it's hard to be asked to market and appeal to something that inherently excludes you. And I think like having worked in fashion for as long as I have, I've realized that there's been a lot of kind of like cognitive dissonance where it's like the ideas that I'm promoting or the ideas I'm asked to promote directly exclude me. And the people around me aren't explicitly saying, hey, you're excluded, but even things like working in apparel stores and being like, hey, like I've noticed this retailer carries up to, let's say, like a double XL. Why don't we ever buy the double XL? And being told to my face, no one buys them. And in those scenarios, especially because I was like the employee, I didn't necessarily feel like I had the agency to be like, I would buy them. So you telling me plainly that you don't think I should have clothes is kind of messed up. If I was in that scenario now, that's what I would do. But at the time, I was just kind of like, okay, like I'm not in a position of power. What can I really say?
The audacity of people to look you in your face and say that there is no consumer base for people your size.
I think they genuinely didn't think that that was my size, because I think a lot of the time, straight size people working in straight size fashion have a perception of what a fat person looks like. And I don't think that that's their fault, because we're not shown fat people very often. In public life or in media representation, it is hard to find clear examples of different ways that people are fat and different ways that fat bodies look, right? So I think that became clearer and clearer when I would go into those scenarios being like, hey, like, I think we should get a bigger size, or like customers are asking, like, they've seen that this retailer makes this size. Why don't we carry it for them? Or clearly carry it for me as well. I think part of that was they just didn't know. Like, they didn't know that they were talking about me, because they were like, well, fat people aren't cool or fashionable or interesting. So clearly that's not you. So it was definitely hard. And I definitely think now I can see how it was damaging, like extremely damaging mentally, because I think it was difficult for me to have one part of my life where, and that one part was like online, where I felt celebrated and encouraged and like my work was worthwhile. And then to simultaneously in the same industry be told, no one's going to buy that size. We only buy black because, like, you know, fat people need to disappear. Holding those two realities was, I think, really hard. And I think that that's why eventually I got out of those environments, because it became too difficult to hold any longer. And I knew it wasn't true, because it's not.
Exactly. And I think too, when people like us, when people like fat people, we get this fat pass.
Yes.
Where it's like, okay, well, we want to be around you and we just don't see you like that. And what the fat
Yes.
pass kind of does is it renders invisible who we are.
Yes.
And a key part of who we are and how we move through the world and what we access, including how we clothe ourselves. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I would be really frustrated if I couldn't use my staff discount at the place where I worked, because they just couldn't see me as who I am, which is someone who wears a size 22, 24. I graduated from high school in 2008, and as you were talking, I was thinking about how soul-crushing looking for a prom dress was. Oh. And what I had to wear. What I had to wear to prom was so humiliating. And, well, at least the first prom I went to. The second prom I went shopping in the States. I learned,
I went shopping in the States for both proms that I went to because of that.
Which is such a privilege. Yeah. I totally want to acknowledge that as well. Because what was available to me to the first prom I went to was this, like, just awful, awful, depressing dress that I found in, like, a sale bin in the Bay. And in my high school, they had made this Facebook group that was like called Don't Steal My Prom Dress. And I went to a high school in a very affluent neighborhood. Did not live in that neighborhood, but I went there because they had a program that I was in. And they were all shopping at like Betsy Johnson and had these like amazing dresses that, I mean, I studied fashion in high school. I wanted to be a designer. And it was just so crushing to see everyone else get to wear these like really cool pieces. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't, because it just wasn't available to me.
It might be surprising to folks now because, especially in marketing, we see far more body diversity. I do think that there are limits to that, but when I think about me as a high schooler or even me in my early 20s versus now, very, very different landscape. I was much smaller then than I am now, and I felt really ashamed in my body then because it was not visible in any way. And the body that I have now, even though it's limited, I do see bodies like mine in fashion marketing. So that shift has been, I think, major in maybe a confidence building way or a normalizing way. I don't see that shift translating to what's actually available on the market as far as clothing, and as far as, you know, clothing that fits properly or well for fat people. But I do want to kind of underscore that things can change drastically in a short period of time, which makes me think that we can actually get to an even better place of change, perhaps in a short period of time in the near future. And that does make me feel hopeful.
And I think that you're right, that there have been leaps and bounds made in the past 10, 14 years. And it does go to show that it can continue to expand. But you make a very good point about how some of the changes that have occurred are that we are seeing more fat bodies in fashion marketing, but that doesn't necessarily translate to an expansion of the items that are actually available for sale to fat people. Mm-hmm. Which feels kind of tokenizing.
It feels extremely tokenizing. And it's complicated because I feel like sometimes I'm in the intersection of all of these things where I'm like, okay, I'm like a digital creator, so I'm, you know, making fashion marketing materials. I'm writing about fashion, so I'm studying what's happening in the industry and observing what's happening in the industry. But I'm also a model, so I'm also like sometimes the body that is in this marketing. But I know, because of the 360 view, like what is actually out there. So it can be kind of jarring sometimes. It makes me feel excited and happy and like we can, have a broader scope of what beauty looks like or what bodies look like and the types of bodies that we accept as, whole human beings. But at the same time, there's many times where I go to set and beforehand I'm asked to bring clothing. And I'm like, no straight size model is ever asked to bring clothing to set. And I am just expected to have the things that they want because I've already done the work in my private life to, hunt down specific items. And they're like, oh, yeah, you can just bring jeans.
I didn't know that straight size models weren't asked to do that. The very brief modeling stint I did as a teenager, we make a model bag. You have, all of your different items that you need. And I genuinely thought that was asked of everybody.
Nope, it's not. Obviously like undergarments and shoes, like that kind of stuff is oftentimes like part of what you would bring to set. But very consistently, I'm asked to bring wardrobe. And I've asked other friends who are models who are straight size, like, hey, like, when you worked with so-and-so, did you have to bring anything? Or like, did because I similarly, I was like, is this just modeling? But also reading about like very, high profile plus size models who work in the industry now and, work with huge publications, major editorial spreads, they also are asked. And they're like the top of the game and they're still asked. So I'm like, so this is just fashion's problem.
I feel like you should be paid as a model and as a stylist then.
Yeah.
If you are also styling the shoe.
I often ask for a stylist fee because I know, because I've worked as a stylist, that this is the stylist's job. And if they're not doing their job and I'm doing it for them, you need to reallocate some of those funds to me, bringing this stuff here for you.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with that more. I want to ask as well, plus size fashion and fat community kind of in general tends to sort of center or prioritize smaller fat folks or even just like larger straight sized folks.
Yeah.
But it's also like a really overwhelmingly white space. And going along this sort of theme of and I don't want to make assumptions, but these feelings of being tokenized as well. As a fat, Black, non-binary creator, how do you feel in that space, which has been heavily whitewashed on top of all these other things?
Mm-hmm. It's tricky. Some days I just try to let it not weigh heavy on my mind. And other times it is really, really frustrating because I've had many roles within the industry. So I have a pretty broad depth of understanding, and there are definitely times that I've been approached for work or asked to do work, and they want me to sort of, give everything of myself, like, speak to the queer elements, speak to the gender elements, speak to my Blackness, but they're also like, yeah, and we also can't pay you anything. So you're lucky to be included, like kind of that like undercurrent of like, you should feel really lucky that you are being asked or being approached because, the marginalized groups that I belong to previously wouldn't have been included. And it already felt bad, but it feels even worse when you are approached for your marginalized identity and you are also told that that is worthless. Like, those two don't really go together to me.
Visibility doesn't pay the bills. And I think, too, that class and economics are a huge factor in terms of maintaining the oppression of a certain population or a certain group. And how dare you suggest that you are uplifting and working in an equitable manner or whatever with this population and then not acknowledge that their time and their knowledge and their skills and their personal experiences, if you want to use them for your own work, cost money.
And costs extra.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like whatever the base pay is for just a person doing this work, like this marketing or ads or whatever, to me, add a bit more on that because you're also asking somebody to do this emotional labor that's attached to it and put themselves out there, which may seem only positive to that brand because they're like, look, like, you're more visible to an audience that you wouldn't usually reach, or like people who don't know about you now will know about your work. But it's also like, yeah, but I'm also exposing myself to people who don't like people like me, to trolls, to, you know, people who could be, cause me extensive like emotional distress. And I think there are companies that understand that and there are companies that don't. But that, like, when I'm thinking about what would I charge for that, if that's a specific factor of our working together, is like that kind of, you know, lived experience or speaking to like marginalized identity, I'm like, that costs you extra.
I'm happy that you're speaking to that and doing that, because I do, again, not to call you like a trailblazer for doing the work, but I do think that that's going to make a difference for people moving forward. I had a similar conversation with a physiotherapy clinic that wanted me to come do a workshop with them. And I have personal experiences with medicalized fat phobia. And I do see that talking about those lived experiences can be re-traumatizing. And this clinic offered me money for that, which I'm not used to. And they asked me what my rate was. And I remember thinking, I really need to reflect on that when you are asking me to re-traumatize myself or talk about my trauma so that you can be better for it, I have a right to charge you for that. And I don't think a lot of people talk about the monetary compensation for that labor, because a lot of our communities, and I am a white person. I realize this is a podcast format, so I should stipulate that I'm not talking about that we share all of the same communities. But marginalized communities in general take on so much additional labor just to exist, just so we can try to function at a fraction that other people get to. And it never occurred to me before that I didn't, not only should I not be paying for those things, but I also should be paid if people were going to try to capitalize on those experiences. You know, like, I don't know. I'm kind of also amazed, and maybe this is my own ignorance about the fashion industry, that you are also asked to speak about experiences that go beyond fashion. Can you explain sort of the context in which that would occur, or where people would place those expectations on you?
Yeah, it's very like case by case, because there's been times where brands have approached me just like kind of in general, and then sort of in our conversation sort of like tacked on that this is what they want me to touch on. And then there's other times, this is more often, is that like it ties into like a certain month or a certain day or that sort of thing. Like, we're a brand and it's Black History Month. Let's use that as an example. So we want you to talk about like your experience as a Black person, or, you know, have specific talking points under the lens of being Black. So it is, oftentimes it's contextual, but it's not always contextual. And the weird thing is like sometimes sniffing that out when they're not saying it explicitly, but they're like heavily implying that that is what they're kind of looking for, which to me is like the most frustrating scenario, because I'm like, if you want to, you know, tokenize me, like, be forthcoming with that, because then the ball is in my court. Like, I can be like, this dollar amount is enough right now to do that labor, or it's not. But when it's kind of like a backdoor, like, oh, you know, it'd be great if you talked about blah, 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 or like, can you expand on X? Like, that I find really just like backhanded and shady. So usually in those scenarios, I'm like, yeah, I'm not good with that. And I just kind of like, if I can, if we haven't gone too far in the negotiation, then I might just say, you know what, this isn't actually like right for me. Thanks for reaching out. And the thing is too, with scenarios where it's more contextual, so let's like use Black History Month as an example. Like, if it's a brand who has never shown Black people on, let's say, their Instagram feed, because that's where like a lot of my work is. So never had Black people on their Instagram feed. Like, let's say they're a brand that doesn't carry my size, which is a thing that happens often, which I find so weird, because I'm like, but you can look at my page and you can literally look at what size I am, because I'm a model. Like, you can find out. So why are you approaching me if you don't even sell things for me? But yeah, like stuff like that, where it's like, I'm getting the sense that you want to work with me because you want the association with me to boost your brand in a way that I don't feel comfortable with, or a way that feels like extremely tokenizing, then I might still say no. But it's hard because, you know, like, we live under capitalism. You can't always say no to everything, especially now that this kind of work is my full-time job. So navigating those things and understanding like what compromises feel doable can sometimes be really tough.
It's interesting to get this sort of behind the scenes perspective too, because I feel like kind of what you're touching on is that when you are approached by companies, you're not given all of the information so that informed consent can be established, which is really dangerous and leaves people very vulnerable to exploitation, which I appreciate too that you mentioned. Obviously, under the constraints and evils of capitalism, we can't always say no to these gigs, but you should have all of the information at your disposal so that you can make an informed decision and not show up to set and then all of a sudden be like, sorry, what are you asking me to do? It just seems like business 101 in a way. I'm curious as to your opinion on what you think Vancouver has to offer fat folks in terms of fashion and clothing.
I just gave a smile or grimace, depending on how you would interpret it. In my experience, and I've lived here for 11 years, almost 12 now, and I've gotten fatter and fatter with every year that I've lived here, the options as far as brick and mortar clothing, very dismal. Very, very dismal. If I were to just name stores where I can go into the store, find something in my size in store, try it on, I know there's less than 10. And of those less than 10, I think maybe one or two are clothing stores that I'm interested in shopping at, because that is also a very big piece. It's not just, is this clothing available, but is this clothing things that fat people want? So I think in terms of fashion, it's a really hard city to live in. I don't really shop in person ever at this point. I just shop online, and that means returns. That means waiting for packages. That means ordering different sizes, and all of that has like a very big environmental impact that is negative. But I think in Vancouver and in Canada in general, that's really the option that fat people have, is you order your stuff and you open the box and you hope that things fit. And if you're ordering from the States, then of course you're paying extra duties, you're paying extra shipping. And if whatever it is doesn't work at all, maybe you've paid $60 that you're just literally never going to see again.
It's so true.
And it's very strange, because Vancouver is viewed as, you know, a liberal city and a modern city, and it's bizarre to live somewhere that just clearly thinks fat people don't exist.
Or if we do, that we shouldn't like leave our homes fully clothed.
Yeah.
And I don't understand that, especially when it comes to like fitness clothing and workout clothing, because, okay, I get it. You think that I should be exercising until I am not fat anymore, but what would you like me to do that in? Like, I don't know when I'm supposed to go hiking. And if there's literally not a single store in this city, except now Old Navy, where I could get a pair of leggings, for example. I feel like too, as a gender nonconforming person myself, that compulsory femininity is really a thing in plus size fashion. I've never had access to clothing or accessories that I feel could reflect my desired aesthetic. And I'm curious what, not to be tokenizing with your experiences as a non-binary person, but like, do you feel like you are easily able to achieve your desired aesthetic or play with clothing in a way that actually feels good or in compliance with who you are as a person?
I think the plain answer is no, but it's like a complicated answer, because up until maybe like 4 years ago, I was somebody who dressed very, very femme, because extremely feminine clothing was the clothing that was made to fit my body, or felt like the most suitable for my body type. And I also like have been on a journey with gender and like how I identify gender wise, and like what that means in interaction with my personal style. And if I dress really femininely, am I non-binary still? The answer is yes, but that one really just throws people for a loop. I think similarly to you, it's really hard to imagine clothing that would really completely satisfy the way I want to express gender, because I just don't see it, and I just have never seen it really. And I don't have any plans to become an extensive sewist anytime soon. So like, it's hard to perceive. I think as the years go by, I find ways to navigate that or subvert that, or like, kind of put my own desires into the way that I express myself through clothes, because to me, personal style is really important, and it's like my main creative expression. So I do try to reflect that in my clothing, but it's just really hard, and there's not very many options. And I think right now is the closest I've ever felt to being like, okay, this is like me, and it's not the compromised me, or like, the version of me that is like possible with whatever's available. Like it is, I feel like I'm moving closer to that, but I don't know. It's rough. The options are rough. And I am constantly surprised at the feedback when companies are asked why they have such a limited offering for fat people style-wise. The feedback that this is what people buy, so that's what we make, is interesting to me, because of what is available for thin people. I think that what's available for, let's say, air quotes, women's fashion in North America, it's between 2 to 8% of clothing is available in plus size clothing. So that means that companies can understand many different sizes, many different styles, variations for thin people who are not actually the population, because fat people are the largest part of the population. But within that little, let's say 5% of clothing that is actually plus sized, people can't even imagine that fat people would have different styles, just different types of clothing that they'd want to wear. And it's very frustrating and it's very limiting, but I think it's also very illuminating to the way that fat people are perceived to non-fat people, particularly in fashion.
And what we would want to put on our bodies, that for the most part they assume, well, we want to hide ourselves or make ourselves smaller or infantilize us in some way. It's confusing and it's frustrating.
Well, because oftentimes companies say we don't, like if they are a company that makes straight size clothing that is going into making extended size clothing, one of the main feedback points is we don't know what fat people would buy. And to that, I would say, what do straight size people buy? Make that.
I hate to say it, but it seems like they hate fat people so much that they would rather forego profit than offer
be associated with fat people.
Yeah.
I feel you 100%. I think there are a lot of companies that would never say that blatantly, but that is the company policy, is the risk of being popular with fat people and therefore in their eyes being undesirable is not worth the hundreds of millions of dollars that they could be making.
As if it would hurt your brand. It's wild. I want to ask you about a recent article that you wrote for Vogue, which is amazing, by the way. I think that's very cool. And I'm going to read it off of this sheet here because I don't want to misquote you. But when you were talking about your adolescence, you wrote, "I always felt like I stuck out. I hated taking up space. It felt like I would always have to compromise my style to accommodate my body, a deeply lonely feeling at an awkward time." And I was really intrigued to read that because I'm going to be honest with you, I wasn't expecting it. Because one of the parts of your style that I really love is how you embrace these very long flowing fabrics or garments like long coats or wide-legged pants or these sort of boxy or maxi dresses or dress shirts. And all of these shapes paired with your very bright color palette take up a lot of space and they demand a lot of attention. And that is what I really appreciate about your aesthetic, is that you do it so well and it encourages people to look at you and admire you. But like you said at the beginning of that article, I do think that fat people shy away from that because we don't want to be so visible, because our fatness just makes us so hyper visible. And often our own feelings of shame towards ourselves kind of keep us from experimenting with those different silhouettes, different fabrics, different shapes. So I'm curious how clothing has impacted your relationship with your body, how you move through public spaces, or what exactly changed where you became more comfortable capturing people's attention and encouraging them to look at you.
I think a key piece of that for me was the realization that my primary or one of my primary creative expressions was clothing. So if I stifled myself or, put these limitations on myself of, oh, I shouldn't wear that color, or, oh, this is like too oversized, all of that kind of stuff, I was just like dampening the thing that comes from within me, the thing that I want to express, the thing that like to me is deeply connected to like my humanity and what brings me joy in the world. So I think that was like a very big piece, is like realizing how important that expression was to me, regardless of kind of what the world tried to tell me I should want. And that wasn't like a quick process by any means. That was over many years. And, I realized so many narratives that I was just telling myself, like nobody was telling me them. And I was holding on to this idea, like, as I've gained weight, like, oh, I shouldn't look for oversized clothes, even though like I like how oversized clothing looks. And I would admire thin people in it, but I would be like, oh, but like I am fat, so maybe I shouldn't be wearing that. And I was like, why am I like, who, like, what is this voice? Who is this? Like, if I'm going to be fat and noticed anyway, like, why should I care? People are always going to have an opinion on fat bodies and the way that they think fat bodies should be presented. So why shouldn't I wear what I want to wear instead of wearing clothes I don't like and still be ridiculed, right? And I think like reaffirming that in myself has really helped me get to the place that I am now.
And I think that paradigm shift in our minds is like, it sounds so cheesy, but it's revolutionary. I can think of a few items in my closet now that make me feel so good. And sometimes I didn't think about how such a simple thing like a piece of clothing can impact your sense of self. Mm-hmm. What can non-fat allies do to make the fashion industry more friendly for fat folks?
There's a lot. I think number one, complain when you notice that brands that you really like are not making any sort of progression to expanding their sizing or, let's say even showcasing bodies in their larger sizing. To me, that is like a very telltale sign. If they make bigger clothing, but they never show people in it. So I would say like, just as a customer, let them know that that's not okay with you, and that, or ask them, why don't you have more sizing? Or like, if this brand is becoming more and more popular, presumably you have more money. Is this something your brand is interested in, or is it important to them? Also, just acknowledging their internalized fat phobia, which is really hard. It's hard to think about the ways that you might hurt people you love. It's hard to think about the ways that you might judge people you don't know. But in my opinion, I think we are raised in a society that is inherently fat phobic. So fat phobia is an ideal that we carry within us, and it's up to us to dismantle that. So I think for thin folks to really, do that internal work and maybe do a bit of reflection on, how fat phobia benefits them and how that might affect the fat folks in their life and how that might make the fat folks in their life feel.
Well, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. Where can people learn more about you and your work? How can they connect with you?
My handle on basically every platform, I think every platform, is Style is Style. So if you search just like at Style is Style on like Twitter or Instagram or TikTok, I think it's Style is Style 1 because Style is Style was taken. Or search my name, Lydia Okello, Okello. Usually I am the person who will pop up for that. So if you want to see my work or, read stuff I've written recently or see what I'm up to, that's the way you would go about doing that.
Perfect. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you. It was so nice to chat.
This podcast is produced and directed by me, Layla Cameron. Both audio and video versions of this podcast were edited by Ari Conrad Birch. Each interview was filmed and audio recorded by Rami McHale. Additional video was filmed and edited by Felix Naud and directed by ETW Media Productions. The music for this season is by the band Parlor Panther. Funding for this podcast is supported by TELUS STORYHIVE.